Good morning. We'll continue with the lesson Lullaby. I was explaining the lesson to you. So today we look at another aspect of this story by Leslie Marmon Silko. So we saw in the last class that the events of the story Lullaby are not in the chronological order, right? So we see most of the action that is described in the story, like the death of Jimmy, how Danny and Ella are taken away from Aya, are all described through Aya's memories, right? This actually has two effects, I would say. It is an objective way of looking at it. So there is a kind of, a kind of lessening of the raw pain of tragedy, right? Because when we look at Aya's life, we understand that she has experienced really terrible misfortunes, but she looks at them from an objective point, or she looks at them from a distance. That means she looks at it from her memories, and that actually kind of lightens the terrible pain that she feels during those moments. And maybe because of that, as readers, we understand why Aya doesn't have much of bitterness. We don't see Aya bitter, right? She looks back at her life, she's sad about it, but she's never bitter about it. So we understand that she's a strong woman, right? It's not that she endures trauma. It's not just trauma. I would say a lifetime of trauma. She suffers all that, but she kind of comes out of it with a sense of peace. So she is a very strong woman, right? And another aspect about looking at Aya's story through her memories or through her reminiscences is also a positive affirmation of the oral traditions. I was telling you about the Native American storytellers. For them, everything was oral, right? It was by word of mouth. The written form was not there. For them, I would say their memories, their stories, their beliefs, traditions, everything would be shared through spoken stories, right? The native people, they've always passed down all their beliefs and their rituals through stories, right? It's the oral tradition or through stories, not the written word. So each culture had its own combination of characters, plots, and they would kind of explain to the world about themselves, right? Lessons, they would explain to the world about their own culture, and that would be kind of passed on to the rest of the world. And that is what Silko is trying to do here. She is trying to copy this tradition, and she uses the third person limited narrator, right? This whole story is told from the third person point of view. When we read Native American stories, we understand that most of the writers or the stories rely on the third person narration, because this personal narrative or the first person narrative, the personal narrative isn't part of the oral tradition, because many of the native cultures did not consider it proper to talk about themselves. So they would employ the third person narrative, right? Or a third person would narrate it. So here also in this particular story, we see how Silko employs a third person narrator, and when she does that, she also shows us how Aya removes herself from the white society. Now, what is the reason? Aya does not speak or write English, right? And if her story has to reach a white audience, it could be it had to be told in her own words, right? So that is how this distance is emphasized, right? So if she had been telling the story, it would never reach, because she didn't know English. That is why Leslie Marmon Silko employs the third person narrative. So if Aya was speaking, see, everyone knows Aya does not know English. So if Aya was speaking, the story would never reach, because we'll have to speak in English, right? That is why this third person narrator is used here. Now, we also see a lot of visual breaks in this text, right? Now, something like, when we read the text, that's why I was asking you to read the text. When you read the text, you see that when you reach halfway through the text, the first break comes. That is how Aya distances herself from Chateau. Why does she distance herself from Chateau? Because she always believes that it was because of Chateau that she lost Danny and Ella, right? Because Chateau had taught her to sign her name, and she was tricked into signing her name onto the paper. Danny and Ella were taken away from her, right? And it brings us to the brings us from the past back to the present, where Aya decides to go into the bar. Now she goes to the bar to search for Chateau, right? Because she knows Chateau would be there spending his money, the money that he had got from the government on drinks, right? So once she goes inside, the narrative goes back to the past again. Now the second narrative, or sorry, the second break brings us back to the present, right? And the third break, it breaks the, I would say, it violates the past to present pattern of the first two. What happens is, it shows us the moment where Aya finally meets Chateau. And therefore, she completes the journey which she started at the beginning of the story. So that is how the breaks are presented in the story. Now, when we read the story, Lullaby, we understand that there are so many things that are mentioned here. One is the cycle of life is mentioned here. The relationship between mother and child, the mothers and children is mentioned here. The importance of remaining true to your own culture, your own heritage is emphasized here, right? So the most significant about all these would be, I would say, the message of Lullaby would be to show the audience or the reader that it is very important that you have to remain true to your own culture and heritage, right? This short story was published in 1974, as I had told you, and that was the beginning of the literary Native American Renaissance, because many Native American authors like Silko, they wrote stories and poems and essays that explicitly as well as implicitly urged Native people to remain true to their heritage and history, maybe to reclaim their heritage and history, right? So their message was that the old ways of native life, including isolation from the white Eurocentric society or the European society, was much better than the forced assimilation to that white culture, because the forced assimilation would rip families and entire tribes. We see that in the case of Danny and Ella, right? Aya belongs to the Navajo heritage, right? And she always remembers the ways taught to her by her mother and grandmother. Everybody in her family speaks English, right? And they're all separated in some way from the Navajo culture. It could be physically, like, Jimmy going away to war and Danny and Ella being taken away from her. Or culturally, culturally is Chateau trusting the words of the white men more than his own instincts or desires, right? So there is this break in this Navajo heritage and culture, right? So Aya is the only one who clings to it, right? So what happens is, when Jimmy goes away, what happens to him? He dies in a helicopter crash. Danny and Ella are taken away from their parents and they assimilate to the European or the Eurocentric culture. They lose their parents and their heritage, right? When they come back, they're unable to speak the native language. And Ella does not even recognize her mother. And what happens to Chateau? Chateau loses his job. He trusts his boss, the white rancher, right? But when he is incapacitated, the rancher throws him out. So he loses his job, his home, his sense of pride, right? So who is right here? It is Aya, who is the only character who remains true to her Navajo roots, right? She's the only character who is at peace at the end of the story. So what is Leslie Marmon Silko trying to tell us? She's trying to tell us that Native Americans who kind of do not subscribe or who do not subscribe to white influence, to white cultural norms, would be would be content, would be safer in the long run, right? So it is always good to stick on to your own culture and to hold that close to your heart. That is what Silko is trying to tell us, right? Lullaby can also be interpreted as a story about the cycle of human life. Because here we see Aya, an old woman, right? At the beginning of the story, we see her as an old woman, and that is the which can I would say it is, and the whole story is spoken to us in the form of memories, right? It's always a interpolation between the past and the present. So she is an old woman, and it is a winter time. And in literature, winter always symbolizes the latter years of life or death itself, right? So, within a few paragraphs of the story, the narrative flashes back to Aya's childhood, where she had been watching her mother and grandmother spin yarn, right? The wool, and weave blankets with it, right? So her memories then progress chronologically from Jimmy's birth to receiving news that he was dead, then to Danny and Ella's removal from her home, and finally the loss of Chateau's job, his illness, and his impending death, right? So Silko implies that the cycle of life and eventual death is natural, and it is not something that you need to always cry about. It's something that is very natural. Now, Aya does not worry about the end of her own life, nor does she cry loudly for Chateau at the end of his. What does she do when Chateau is dying? She sings him a lullaby. That is to reassure him that even when he passes on to the next world, she will follow him. And Jimmy is there waiting for them. That is the kind of celebration of life, right? It's not something that you mourn about, because it's very natural. Cycle of life and death is very natural. It is not something that you mourn. You kind of pass on from one world to the other in a very peaceful manner. That is what Aya tries to tell us, right? So it's not very explicitly mentioned that Chateau is about to die at the end of the story. But Aya knew that with the wine he would sleep, right? He would not feel it. That's how it is said in the story. You have to read the story to get the exact words, right? So she says, in the end, it is said like this: Aya knew with the wine he would sleep, he would not feel it. Now, this it to which the narrator refers is death. So Chateau is old, he's drunk, he's sick, and he isn't healthy enough to survive the freezing winter, right? So, it is like you see how Aya sings to him, but Aya may not love him in the marital sense, because she is always angry with Chateau because she believes that it was because of Chateau that she lost her two children, Danny and Ella. She had lost two children earlier to death. She had lost Jimmy in the war, and then Danny and Ella were the only ones left. And that's because of Chateau that she loses them also. So she does not love him much in the marital sense, but she does not hate Chateau anymore towards the end, right? So, the kind of affection that we see in Aya for Chateau towards the end is a kind of maternal love. And she plans to take care of him through the end of his life. That is why she sings the lullaby for him, right? So it is important to remember that the Navajo tribe traditionally they feared the dead. They tried to avoid all kinds of unnecessary contact with the dead, right? So I feel Aya would be concerned that an improper, unceremonious burial of Chateau's body would actually turn him into some kind of evil spirit that would haunt her for the rest of her life, right? However long or short it would be. So that is why she sings him the lullaby, right? She doesn't want to show her hatred. So she has this maternal affection. So it's a motherly love for Chateau, and it is best exemplified by the lullaby she sings at the end of the story, right? And you should read the lyrics of the lullaby. It can be read as a poem, right? Because that particular lullaby incorporates the Navajo beliefs about the relation between human beings and the natural world, right? So as the song says, the earth is our mother, the sky is the father, right? And the rainbow is the sister, the wind is the brother, and everywhere, they're like, we need not feel sad to be apart from the family. And the last lines of the lullaby, we are together always. There never was a time when this was not so. It is meant to comfort Chateau and also to comfort Aya. She remembers the lullaby while thinking how much she loved her babies, right? They remain with her, all her 5 children. Even though they're not physically present with her, they are there in her heart, right? So that is what this song reminds. It's not just comforting Chateau, it's also a comfort for her, right? So that's what she says, we are always together. There never was a time when this was not so. We're always together. Physically, we might be apart. So that's what she's telling Chateau. Physically, you might go away from me, but you will get reunited with our 3 children, with Jimmy, right? Our 2 other children whom we lost as very small babies. And soon I will also follow, right? So there was never a time when we were not together. Physically, we might not be together, but each one holds the other in his or her heart, right? So we understand that this story is the movement of the story follows Aya's consciousness through associations, connections of images, and she moves forward in her journey, right? And she always drifts back to her past, comes back to her present. So, and when we look at the imagery of the story, I was talking about the Yebichai songs, right? It is all in the first. I just read the first paragraph for you. It starts off like this: the story. The sun had gone down, but the snow in the wind gave off its own light. It came in thick tufts like new wool, washed before the weaver spins it. Aya reached out for it like her own baby's hand, and she smiled when she remembered how she had laughed at them. She was an old woman now, and her life had become memories. She sat down with her back against the wide cottonwood tree, feeling the rough bark on her backbones. She faced east and listened to the wind and snow sing a high-pitched Yebichai song. Out of the wind, see Yebichai's song, out of the wind she felt warmer and she could watch the wide, fluffy snow fill in the tracks steadily until the direction she had come from was gone. By the light of the snow, she could see the dark outline of the big arroyo. See, arroyo, it's a kind of creek, right? See, arroyo, Yebichai, these are all part of Navajo traditions and culture. That's how we know that Aya was a Navajo woman. It's not doesn't come to an end there. She was sitting on the edge of the Ceboleta Creek. Now, Ceboleta is a Spanish word for spring onion. Now, Ceboleta is again a Navajo word. Where in the springtime, the thin cows would graze on the grass already chewed flat to the ground. In the wide, deep creek bed, where only a trickle of water flowed in the summer, the skinny cows would wander looking for new grass along winding paths splashed with manure. So these are some of the imagery that is mentioned here. The Yebichai are spiritual beings according to Navajo culture. They're called holy people. They're powerful individuals who inhabit the sacred mountains, springs, and holy sites. And you know what the Navajo people do is they call in the Yebichai to during ceremonies, and they feel that the Yebichai can heal. So when they have rituals for healing the sick or the injured, they call the Yebichai. So the Yebichai song is a sacred song, a part of a healing ritual. And when Aya hears the wind singing such a song, it signifies that her story may be understood as a healing ritual, right? So this is, it's a healing for her also, a healing of her mind, a healing of the raw pain that threatens to kind of rip her heart apart, right? So when she hears the wind, she feels the Yebichai song. So what is the significance? The significance is that the story could be a healing ritual for her. So the lullaby at the end of the story is titled The Lullaby, and we see the lullaby being sung at the end of the story. So the lullaby at the end of the story, it's very important. So when you justify the title, we can say that it is a kind of healing, right? At the end of the story, when Aya sings the lullaby, it echoes the form of many healing songs in its structure of verse and repetition, as well as in the imagery of the earth mother, the father who is the sky, the sister who is the rainbow, the brother who is the wind, right? So we see that it's an elegy. Elegy would be a song that is sung for mourning, right? So the lullaby could be compared to an elegy, right? A kind of tribute that is paid to a mourning tribute that is paid to somebody who is dead. So it is, this elegy or this lullaby concludes with a return to the healing song and a reconciliation on many levels. See, she was alienated from her husband after her children were taken away. So it is reconciliation with Chateau, right? And it is also a healing of her mind, a healing of her heart. Because when she sings the song, we understand that we're always together. So her children would be taken away from her. They might have died. They might have been, they're not with her physically anymore, but she is with them. The kind of, that's what she says, we are together. So nothing can separate them. So that is what this lullaby brings into context. The healing that takes place, the reconciliation. She knows Danny and Ella are gone from her. She knows they will get assimilated to the white Eurocentric culture, the culture of the whites, or the Europeans. But she knows that they're always with her as her own, right? So she's the one who sticks on to the traditions. All the others have left the traditions, the Navajo tradition. And she sticks on to that, and she is healed at the end. So that is why we see her not bitter. We see her at peace. She is able to reconcile herself with her estranged husband. See, she had never been with her after Danny and Ella were taken away from her. She did not even share the marital bed with him, right? Because that was the kind of anger she had in her heart towards him. But that also kind of slowly melts away because she knows Chateau is leaving, like he's going into the other world, and she will soon follow him. So that is the story Lullaby for you. So do you have any questions or anything, if you have any questions with regard to this, you can ask me, and I would ask you to read the story to get a better idea of this. Any questions?